Hey everyone, and welcome to our August National Sewing Circle live event. Once again with Nicki LaFoille here to answer all of your sewing questions. So glad you're here, Nicki.
Me too.
All right, we're going to get started right away with a question from Julie, and she wants to know, what is your best advice to teach a new student?
Well, teaching new students, sometimes new students can get overwhelmed with all of the sewing information that it seems like you need to know before you can really get started. So my advice is always to start small. Just make sure that you read through your machine manual so that you are not, going to hurt yourself or damage your machine. And then from there, you can just kind of trial and error and practice and start with small projects. Starting with a lined blazer is just going to frustrate a newbie and, seem very overwhelming. So start with small things. Even like a pair of pants would probably be too much for a newbie. So very small things, a scarf, a skirt, something easy like that to, get their feet wet and get them rolling, and to accumulate knowledge slowly. So once you know how to sew a skirt, you'll know how to work with cotton and elastic, and then build from there. So start small. Don't be afraid of trial and error. Just jump in and start trying things, and your knowledge will accumulate and grow. And make sure you are changing your needle between projects. A dull needle can cause a lot of problems and cause a lot of frustration. So change your needle. I usually do it between every project, or every like 6 to 8 hours of sewing on a single needle. So if a project only takes an hour of sewing, you don't necessarily have to change it between projects, but about 6 hours of sewing on a needle to avoid lots of frustration.
Absolutely. So if you're someone like me who maybe never remembers how long they've been using a needle, or don't change it after every project, like what's the telltale sign that, oh, I need to change my needle?
Yes. If you start getting flagging, so if your fabric starts kind of jumping on your machine bed and you start hearing a little thunk, thunk, thunk noise as your needle pierces the fabric, that's one sign of a dull needle, and you should probably change that. If you start getting tension issues, like thread nests or just really bad tension, and messing with the tension dials isn't fixing it, it's probably a dull needle. So those are some red flags.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, this is from Christine, and she wants to know what a good starter embroidery machine would be.
Embroidery machines, so like sewing machines, there are a lot of different embroidery machine manufacturers and different, different models at different price points. So like I always recommend when I'm recommending sewing machines, to test drive some or go on the manufacturer websites to kind of check out the features that they have. If you want, a touch screen or a certain size, you can check that out online beforehand before going in and test driving one. I know FOF makes a lot of great embroidery machines. When I worked at Sew News Magazine and I would do embroidery projects, we had a FOF embroidery machine, and that's the one that I would always use. But I know a lot of different brands make them. I believe I know Baby Lock does. I believe Singer does as well. And you can check all the sewing machine websites and see if they do embroidery as well. Brother, Bernina, Janome, what have you. You can check that out online, and start probably with something a little bit at a lower price point, maybe just to see how much embroidery you're going to do, or if like this is what you want to do. You want to get started in an embroidery business. It might be worth it to pay the extra cost to get something that's got a lot of features and will do all of the things that you want it to do. So it really depends on your embroidery goals, your price point, the things that you like to do. So it's very personal. So do a little research online, and it's definitely worth it to go test drive some at a dealer.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yep.
All right, and next question here, this is from Maureen, and she says, I found a saying that I really like and want to embroider it on a t-shirt. I checked on a YouTube, and the video I watched said to put 2 pieces of iron-on stabilizer on the shirt and place a tearaway in the frame. It said to not hoop the t-shirt, but to pin it to the stabilizer in the hoop. That sounds funny, but is it correct or something that you would do?
Yes, that sounds right to me. You might not want to hoop that t-shirt because when you hoop certain fabrics, they can get stretched out or can get hoop burn, which just means when you hoop it, you know, you kind of clip it into the frame, that fabric gets really pinched in that frame, and it can cause marks on your fabric, and it can stretch it out, especially with a knit fabric like a t-shirt. So that does sound right to me. Hoop the stabilizer and then just place the fabric on top of it, and you can secure it with temporary spray adhesive or pins, or just make sure they're outside of the embroidery area. Or you can like clip it, if you can, clip it to the frame or tape it to the frame or something. Just making sure that it is secure on that stabilizer so it's not going to shift when you're embroidering, and making sure that, you know, the rest of the shirt is like rolled up and out of the way and not like getting in the embroidery area. So that sounds right.
Okay, what about the 2 pieces of iron-on stabilizer? Instead of doing 2, could you just use maybe heavier or something?
I think a heavier might be too much for the jersey knit t-shirt fabric. I think 2 layers, it would provide the stabilization you need, but it wouldn't be like too thick and bulky when you're wearing it. So that makes sense to me too.
Gotcha. Perfect. You know a lot more about embroidery than I do. All right, our next question here, this is from Jessica, and she says she's a Serger newbie, and she says any go-to practice project suggestions would be great.
Practice projects on a serger. I haven't done a whole lot on a serger myself, but I know it's really easy to take like a square of fabric and just serge the edges, and you can make washcloths, tablecloths, I don't know what else.
Perfect,
but
like baby shower gifts, like burp rags or receiving blankets. Right. I mean, anything.
Yeah, yep, and yeah, that thin cotton fabric is good for that, but also even like fleece fabric for blankets. Instead of like cutting and tying the edges, you can just serge the edges to finish them off. So you can get started doing that. Pillowcases are a great, easy project too. You know, you could just serge the outer edges of that, and then serge the seam, the long seam and the short seam. So that would be a nice, easy place to start too. But yeah, just serging the edges of any square or rectangular pieces of fabric is a good way to get a feel for your serger and the things that it does.
Absolutely, and we do of course have a couple of videos that show that. I believe one of them is on how to make, it's more of like she makes a dog blanket or blanket for her dog for the dog bed. But then you mentioned the napkins too, and she does, ZJ Humbach is the instructor, but she also does do some napkins, but then does this really cool circle one that then somehow gets folded into like a Christmas tree and looks super cool. Wow. So I mean, that's still the same thing. It's just rather than a square or rectangle, it's just a circle, and then just the way it gets folded kind of looks like a tree. So if you're thinking ahead for maybe Christmas presents or ideas, there you go.
Nice.
All right, our next question here, this is from Margie, and she says, what can I use to stiffen FSL projects? Which I think means freestanding lace.
Yes, FSL would be freestanding lace. So if you are, I believe, you embroider that freestanding lace yourself. To stiffen those projects, so you can use like a a water-soluble stabilizer to stitch those out on, and then just use a Q-tip with some water to dissolve the stabilizer from the outer edge and try to leave the rest within the lace to try to stiffen it a little bit. But then if the project is going to be washed later on, that doesn't do you a whole lot of good. So to stiffen those for maybe attaching to something else in a sewing project or something, you can use a spray stiffener. I know I had some in my stash called Stiffen Quick. I don't really recall the manufacturer of it, but Stiffen Quick, I'm sure I got it at Joann Fabrics, but it's just kind of like a spray glue. It comes in a bottle that you just kind of spray on. I used it actually, I bought some lace and I made it into a crown. And so I just, made it into that circle shape and then sprayed my Stiffen Quick on it, and it held the shape. I had to do it once and then let it dry and then do it again for it to hold the shape that I wanted to sit atop my head. But it worked. So I'm sure there are other products like that out there, but that's the only one I know of, and I think that it would work for that use.
Perfect. All right, our next question here, this is from Cindy, and she says, thank you for the live series. She wants to know, do you hoop the towels you embroider on, or do you suggest to spray or pin on stabilizer on the towel you're embroidering on?
For towels, it depends on what kind of material you're working with. If you're embroidering on a thick terry cloth, I would just hoop the stabilizer and pin that on top. Hooping something thick is pretty tough. But if you are embroidering just like a thin dish towel, or that whatever thin toweling kind of,
like cheesecloth almost or something?
Yeah, something like that. You could hoop that. You could definitely hoop that. But yeah, it's just the thick things that can give you trouble when hooping. So.
Absolutely. All right, next question here. This is from Marina. She says, hello, Nikki. Do you recommend pre-washing fabrics before sewing? And then I guess specifically for kitchen linen projects.
Yes, I do recommend pre-washing, and especially probably for kitchen linen projects, because those will probably get washed quite a bit. So you want to wash that first to get rid of any shrinkage that might happen, get rid of the sizing on the fabric, and that just means, the sizing is like the excess dye or, things that the manufacturer has treated the fabric with. So washing that will get rid of the excess dye and things, and so that after you sew your project, when you wash it, it's not going to like stretch and, twist and shrink in weird ways. So yes, especially for kitchen linen projects, I would definitely pre-wash your fabric. And for all sewing projects, pre-washing is a really good idea for all of those same reasons. When a project isn't really going to get washed, like if you're doing something that's just going to hang on a wall, or some other project that wouldn't get washed for some reason, it's not as important, especially if it's a fabric that can be tricky to wash. That's a scenario when I would say it's not entirely necessary, and it would maybe do you more harm than good to try washing a tricky fabric if you're not going to wash it after you sew it anyway. But 95% of the time, I do recommend pre-washing. And for yardage of fabric, here's a trick for pre-washing. I fold my yardage with raw edges together and baste the raw edges together. Especially for like a cotton fabric that might fray at the end, keeping those raw edges together and basted together will prevent it from getting all like tangled into a frayed ball in the washer. So that's what I always do for pre-washing.
Perfect. I'm gonna use that tip next time. Even though I have to say I don't always pre-wash my fabric either. Maybe I'm not the best proponent at like the tips you should be doing.
Well, I know it's sometimes when you're really excited to get started on a project, I have been known to skip that step as well. So
Yeah.
we're all guilty of it.
Okay, good. All right, next question here. This is from Larissa, and she says, do you have to take the jean pocket completely off to embroider on it?
I would say yes. If you're embroidering on like the back pocket of a pair of jeans, you want to embroider the pocket. If you embroider like through the pocket in the pants, then you would not be able to use the pocket anymore. If you want to just do like a little border around, maybe you'd still get some use out of the pocket. Yeah, I would take that pocket off to embroider on it, because for a pocket it's kind of impossible to like turn it wrong side out and only embroider on the pocket while it's still attached. So I do think you're going to have to unstitch that pocket and take it off to embroider it.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. All right, our next question here. Christine says, how do you secure stitches on a serger? And I maybe the beginning and end, maybe?
So for a serger, I might be wrong because I haven't used a serger a whole lot, but I don't think serger stitches will unravel. And I know a lot of seams on a serger, if you're stitching seams, they'll overlap one another. So that's kind of catching one end. And I know I have a memory of using a serger in college, and we were sewing like stitching a sleeve into an armhole or something. It was something, a circular seam, and we just went over the end of the seam with the beginning of the seam, and that really extra locked it. But for some reason I'm thinking that serger stitches don't really unravel like from the end. So that's, I might be wrong there, but you could test that out if you've got a serger. Try pulling on the end and see if it unravels. I don't think it will. It kind of locks itself.
Yeah, I think you're correct too. The only thing I'm thinking of is when you come around, like you said, you overlap it, and then you just cut it. And then I know I've seen some of the instructors either tie those, because you will have just a couple strings, either tie them in a knot or put a little fray check or just something on there, so you don't have just these 2 little or 4 little threads or however many you're using.
Because you can't backstitch on a serger. It's not the same as a sewing machine.
Right. Yep. Perfect. All right, this question here is from Peggy, and she says, my sewing teacher taught me how to sew without a store-bought pattern. We used my measurements to make our own pattern, and then she told us how much material to buy, but we didn't learn how to determine how much fabric to buy. So that's my question. How do I determine how much fabric to buy without using a store-bought pattern?
Yes, that is the problem. So it's a great, wonderful, amazing thing to know how to draw your own patterns, and I highly recommend it for everyone. But that is the issue. You don't have the chart there saying if you want to make this size of this pattern by this much yardage. So so what do you do? It's tough with garments. With quilts, if you know the size of the quilt and the size of the blocks, you can calculate the yardage you need of your fabric. But with clothes, the pattern pieces are shaped oddly, and it all depends on the pattern style and the pattern size. So if a pattern has a lot of gathers, you're going to need a lot more yardage than a pattern that is more closely fitted. So there's no real good calculator out there, or a trick or a rule to estimate. So what I always do, and it's a little more time consuming and labor intensive, but exactly what you're getting and what you need. I always, when I draw my pattern, I lay it out as if I was cutting out the pattern. Lay it out on the floor, and I say, okay, if I'm going to get a 45-inch wide fabric. So I I measure that out, and I lay my pattern pieces out either on my cutting mat or on a piece of yardage that is uncut that I can like visualize, or just lay it out on the floor and measure my 45 inches wide, or if I'm cutting things on the folds, you would measure half that and lay out your pieces on the fold, and then lay out your other pieces that you only need in a single layer. So you kind of do this mock cutting layout and then measure how much yardage you need. And I then usually add like a quarter to a half a yard, just in case I made a mistake in measuring that, or in case I make a mistake when cutting, I'll have a little bit extra to play with. But that's what I always use. That's the method I always do to figure out my yardage for each specific pattern. And then you'll want to write that down on your pattern for that pattern size so that you remember for next time.
Yeah, you don't want to have to do it twice.
No, for sure.
Perfect. All right, this next question here, this is from Shirley, and she says, I am a newbie and would like to know what embroidery decoupage is and how it is done.
Decoupage. That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that one. I feel like decoupage.
It's like where you put all the little pieces on, isn't it? Something like that?
Right. Decoupage. In my mind, that term, it has to do with like newspaper and glue,
Well, isn't that Mod Podge? Oh, but no, that could be decoupage. I guess when I read it, I was thinking like you would make all these little embroidery like shapes, almost like freestanding lace, but then you have to put them on a project or something.
Right. I'm not familiar with that. Yeah, I'm sorry. I've not heard that term before. That's a new one for me.
We're gonna have to figure it out, and then maybe we can convince Nikki to do a video on it or something later.
Yeah.
All right. Our next question here, this is from Jessica, and she says, I have been asked to teach a mommy and me class. I am thinking of having the kids do a pillowcase and the moms do a pillowcase dress. What are some other simple projects for kids that could be also altered for experienced sewers?
That's a great question, and that sounds really fun, a mommy and me sewing class. That is great. Some other projects, so a kid could do a project and then a more experienced sewer could do something kind of the same. I'm thinking maybe like the pillowcases are great, but also maybe a pouch or something. The kids could do just a plain old regular pouch, just a open pouch, or maybe with a button and loop closure or something, and then a more experienced sewer could add in a zipper at the top or make it lined or something, or add like a little like loop handle for a wristlet. That's something just off the top of my head. But you can look for easy kid sewing projects. Sew It All magazine was geared toward beginners, so sewitallmag.com and sewitalltv.com still have a lot of free projects available, so you can take a look at those and then see if you can modify them or add in some more things for a more experienced sewer. But that's great. Good luck with that. That sounds fun.
It does sound a lot of fun. I have to say, I mean, my son's only 4 months old, but I'm pretty excited to like teach him how to sew. He's gonna learn. Like he's gonna be able to put buttons and stuff on. But I'm already learning things.
Nice.
All right, next question here. This is from Mary Jo, and she says, can you please explain the reason why a binding would be attached on the front of one project but on the back of another?
So with binding, if you attach from the front and then wrap over to the back, or if you attach from the back and wrap over to the front, it's still doing the same thing. It is binding and protecting those raw edges. So it's, it does the same thing. When I ever have occasion to bind anything, I always stitch the binding on the front and then wrap it around to the back so that I can stitch in the ditch from the front and catch that fold on the back. And that way the stitching on the binding on the back is kind of concealed. But you could stitch it on the back, wrap it around to the front, and then slip stitch that fold to the front. to have you know, an invisible seam there. So it's doing the same thing. I have not seen any projects where they say specifically to stitch it on the back and wrap it around to the front. I've always seen it done stitched onto the front and then wrapped around to the back, but there's no like right or wrong way to do it. It all depends on, you know, how you were taught, what kind of look you're going for, because you can use, you know, invisible thread too if you want to stitch it on the back and wrap it around to the front. You can use invisible thread to stitch that down on the front and have a kind of invisible join there as well. But if you run across a project that says to do it one way, but you don't want to, if it says to stitch it on the back and wrap it around to the front, but you would rather stitch it on the front and wrap it around the back, you're going to get, you know, it's not going to affect the look of your, or the functionality of your project. You can do it whatever way is more comfortable to you. Like I said, it's doing the same thing. It's going to get you to the same point. It's just protecting and binding those edges.
Absolutely. I think the only time it may matter would be more of like in a quilting standpoint. Like if like competition quilts might be judged differently as to whether they're hand stitched, you know, on the back or front. So I think it would, not from a sewing standpoint, I don't think it would matter, just maybe a quilting. But you might have to like look something like if you're gonna, you know, enter something into a show, know sort of what their guidelines are, something like that.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. Competition quilts, right?
Yeah. All right, so this next question here, Nikki and I were discussing earlier because we hadn't thought about it ever before, but someone asked, I have my machines in a separate building that's not heated all of the time. Will this harm my machine?
Yeah, and Ashley and I were like scratching our heads like, that hadn't crossed our minds before, because
we're so attached to our machines, they're just always right. No.
Right, we sleep with them in our beds. But yeah, now that we're thinking about it, I think if you have a computerized machine, that would definitely be a concern, because if the componentry of the computerized components gets too cold, that could affect the function of them. It could affect the screen, the viewing screen. If the LCD gets too cold, it might affect your colors or something. And then I was just reading online, the condensation, when you bring something from the cold back into the warm, if any condensation got in those computerized components, water and computerized hardware does not mix. So that could definitely be a concern. But for machines that are not computerized, we were thinking that would probably be fine for those. The cold shouldn't affect even the metal parts of your machine. If possible, I would let it warm up before you start sewing on it again. But even that, I'm not sure if that would affect a machine that was not computerized. But if it was computerized, I would definitely try to keep that at a room temperature and not let that get too hot or too cold.
Yeah, absolutely. See, it's always fun when we read a question that you're like, oh, I never would have thought of that. That's kind of cool. All right, our next question here. I'm 5'2" and I usually have to shorten skirt patterns. Where should this be done on a flared or A-line skirt to minimize pleating?
So to shorten an A-line skirt, I would go, you could go from around the hip line, slash around the hip line, which is the widest, wherever the widest part of your hips is. Measure that, the widest part of the pattern. Although I guess in a flared skirt that wouldn't be true. About 8 inches down from your natural waist is your hip line. So you can measure that on the pattern. That is usually where lengthen and shorten lines are, it seems, on commercial patterns. So you can slash there and or fold that up and then just true that line back in for your side seams. Or you can slash off the bottom for a flared skirt. I don't think there would be any problems or any ramifications to just taking a little bit off of the bottom there. So that would probably be the easier route. And like I said, I foresee no problems in just, taking a little bit off the bottom.
Absolutely. Easiest way is usually sometimes the best way.
Yeah, I like that.
All right, our next question, this is from Kathy, and she says, what do you suggest as a first embroidery project for high school students?
For a first embroidery project, you want to do something nice and easy and simple. You want to embroider on a fabric that isn't going to stretch out, a fabric that's going to be easy to hoop. So a regular old quilting cotton is a really good place to start embroidering. And if you embroider on a square of quilting cotton, you can do a bunch of things with it. You can make a throw pillow, you can make it into a towel or something like, anything that you can stitch a square onto. You can stitch an embroidered square onto a little tote bag or something. So something nice and easy and simple that doesn't require a whole lot of extra planning to get them started on embroidery would be a good place to start.
Would you have any suggestions of like girl projects versus guy projects? Just because, I mean, if I was a dude, I might not want to make a tote bag. I don't know.
Or a throw pillow, probably.
Yeah, that's true.
Guy projects, man, that's tough.
The only thing this is why I just threw it out. The only thing I can think of is I just picture like guys wearing like hats or something, and maybe like something that you could embroider and make into sort of a patch to put on a hat or something like that.
Sure.
It's the only manly project I could think of.
Yeah, actually, you can embroider even like a little square and make it into a pocket and have them stitch their shirt. Or definitely you can stitch on a little square, just fold the edges under and have it be a patch for wherever you want to patch. It's a really good idea. And as far as designs for that, I would just not choose any designs that are too like heavy and thick and dense with satin stitches, because the more stitches you're laying down in one place, the thicker it gets, and there's potential for problems. So just to make everything go as smoothly as possible for new embroiderers, choose a design that is a little bit more open.
Absolutely. All right, this next question here, this is from Pam, and she says, is it a good idea to learn sewing online?
Absolutely. I think the internet is a wonderful place, just full of people who are willing to share their knowledge and full of great resources, especially with National Sewing Circle videos and even all the YouTube videos there are out there. Being able to see people sewing and see what they're doing is really invaluable and wonderful for people who live, in places where they don't offer sewing classes, or for people who, can't afford a one-on-one sewing instructor, or can't afford to go to actual classes. A lot of times online resources are more affordable. And there's any project you want to do is available at your fingertips. Just type it into your search bar and type, quilts tutorial, or, couch cushion tutorial, anything you want tutorial, and I guarantee you will find something out there to help you along. So I think it's a great idea to learn sewing online. For myself, when I was going through school, I know my college classes, it was really really great to be able to learn hands-on and to do it with the instructor there. But there is something to be said for being able to do things at your own pace as well. So if you have a video up and you forgot something, you can pause it and go get it, or you've got to go do something else. You can, do it in little chunks, and it's also not as much of a time commitment as going and doing classes in person. So I recommend it. I think it's great.
Well, so here's a follow-up. This is also a question that we got. They want to know, is it possible to learn how to sew properly through videos only without a physical teacher supervising or correcting your mistakes?
Absolutely. You want to find a resource that you trust, and it all depends on the quality of the video that you're watching and the time and effort that you're willing to put into it. But I absolutely think it is possible to do, and there's something to be said for doing your research on different methods, and finding lessons from different teachers, I think is also great, because you can see that there are many different methods of getting to the same place. And one of the things that I love about sewing is that there's no one straight path to get anywhere. There's different methods of doing things, and so it's easy to look at something and kind of find your own way as well. So I think it's 100% doable to learn to sew properly, to learn to sew well through videos only.
Yeah, I agree too. And I also think it's good to not always have somebody there to correct your mistake, rather like figure out what you did wrong and then figure out how to fix that sort of thing. I think you'll remember that better than if someone just tells you, oh, no, do this instead.
Absolutely. Yeah, mistakes are the greatest teacher.
Yes. I think we've both made a few mistakes, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah.
All right, our next question here. How do you split a larger embroidery project so you can use it in a smaller hoop?
Like splitting a design?
Well, split is in quotes, is how the question came in. I'm assuming yes. So if you only have a smaller hoop, but the design's bigger, is there a way you can sort of like partition it so you can still embroider it and then maybe put it back together?
I don't know. I imagine with an embroidery software you might be able to, but I haven't really noodled around too much in embroidery software, so I'm not sure the functionality of that. In theory, it seems like it could be something you could do, but I'm not sure.
I mean, this next question kind of goes along with it, so I don't know if you have any history with this either, but someone would like to know how to digitize their own images to then transfer to their embroidery machine.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that is possible with digitizing software. I don't know exactly the step-by-step, and I'm sure with different like brands of digitizing software it might be different too. But I'm pretty sure that you could look around at the different software that you can get on your computer, and you can upload or scan in an image and transfer that into an embroidery design. I do think that is possible.
That was also, I mean, I know we both worked for an embroidery magazine, but that wasn't something that we had to do ever.
No, it isn't.
No. All right, our next question here. When I'm buying a sewing pattern, it gives me loads of information, but it does not tell me what needle I should be using with the material it tells me to buy. How do I know what to use?
That's a good point. With all the information that it gives you, it doesn't tell you the needle to use. I never thought of that. That's something they should include.
This is two things now that some people have brought to our attention that we've never thought of.
Yeah. See, this is a learning experience for us as much as viewers. So the needle that you should use for a project, so in general, an all-purpose needle is great to use. When you want to start diverging from the all-purpose needle is when you are getting into different kinds of fabrics. So knit fabric, you want to use a ballpoint needle. Sometimes it might be called a jersey needle or a stretch needle, but they're all basically the same type of needle. They're made for knit and stretchy fabrics. The ballpoint needle, instead of having a really pointed tip, the tip is slightly rounded so that it doesn't cut through the threads of the knit and possibly creates runs and snags. It kind of nestles in between the knit fibers to preserve the stretch of the fabric. If you are using a really thin, fine fabric like chiffon or even satin, you might want to try a microtex needle. And a thin all-purpose needle might be fine for those fabrics, but if you are getting tension issues, if you're getting, if you see the needle is making holes, like visible holes in the fabric, or if you're getting, you know, runs and snags, you can try a microtex needle. The microtex needle just has a really, really sharp, fine point at the end, and it is made for thin, fine fabrics. If you're using a leather or a faux leather, they make leather needles, which just have a reinforced blade, since that, you know, leather and faux leather can be very thick and bulky. So it has a reinforced shaft, and the tip is like a chisel tip, so it can really puncture that thick fabric. If you are making something with denim, like jeans, they make denim needles. Sometimes they're called jeans needles. That is, you know, the construction of the needle is specific to the needs of when you're sewing denim fabric. Of course, when you're embroidering, you use an embroidery needle. If you are top stitching, they make a top stitch needle. And the top stitch needle just has a larger eye, since top stitch thread is generally thicker. The larger eye of the top stitch needle allows that top stitch thread to flow through without adding more tension and causing tension issues and thread breakage and things like that. They make, I believe, a metallic needle for if you're stitching with metallic thread, and that also just has a larger eye, since metallic thread is constructed as a thin ribbon and not really thread. So the larger eye of the metallic needle allows that to go through without shredding that ribbon, the metallic ribbon, that's the metallic thread. So those are, I think, the main categories off the top of my head of needles. I can't really think of any others. So when you're diverging from like a medium weight woven fabric is when you need to start thinking about maybe using a different type of needle. But it's not all the time. Like, there's a lot of faux leathers that I have sewn on that I've used an all-purpose needle on. If they're, you know, really thin and flexible, an all-purpose needle, you know, was fine for me. And all-purpose needles, I mean, all needles come in different sizes. So if you're using a thinner, finer fabric, you can try going down sizes on the all-purpose needle to get, you know, a thinner shaft on the needle. So needle sizing, it's not like gauge sizing. It's the smaller the number, the smaller the needle, the thinner the needle, and the bigger the number, the wider, the larger the needle. So you can play around with the sizes as well before, as well as, you know, branching out into other types of needles. So that's like a basic guide. And on, I think Schmetz Needles, they offer like a PDF guide or something, a really easy printable that is a nice, like, this needle is what you use for this. And it's a really handy guide to have for just like a quick glance of, okay, what needle should I use if I'm using this fabric? So that, that's a neat thing to look at too.
Absolutely, and of course we have a video related to that. Another one of our instructors, Jill Case, did a video where she highlighted several of those needles, and she actually had that Schmetz guide that you talked about printed off, and so she has it there. And I think We may have to update it. It should be in the description. You can click on the link to get to that Schmetz guide. If not, it's in the comment section below. But yeah, like she said, just go to their website and it's an easy downloadable guide. So, all right, our next question here. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but have you ever made your own shoulder pads? And if so, where do you place them?
Yes, I have made my own shoulder pads.
Really? Have you worn something with shoulder pads in it?
Well, no. So that was
Okay.
a special thing. It was my honors senior project in college, and anyway, I designed like a 1940s outfit, and
Okay.
so I made my own shoulder pads.
Okay.
So you want to place the thick side of the shoulder pad on like the seam of the shoulder, so that it then, you know, tapers down to the thinner side that goes up to your neck. So what I learned and what I did when I did my project in college was to place the edge of the shoulder pad right at the shoulder point, where ideally your shoulder seam would be between the bodice and the sleeve, so right at the shoulder seam.
Perfect. I've never made shoulder pads. Okay. Our next question here. I have been working with cotton that is wrinkly as part of the design of the fabric. How do I get the seams ironed without taking out the wrinkle of the fabric?
That's a good question. That's something that we run across when we're using specialty fabrics. That's something that was a consideration when sewing with velvet. So I just did a lot of sewing with velvet. So how do you get your seams pressed open when you're not really sure that you want to press the fabric? So you can do finger pressing, just, you know, place it on the board and kind of press it with your fingers, and sometimes that's enough. I know they make irons that have a really tiny tip, but I a lot of times will just use the very tip of my iron to get right just along the seam line. You can also just use steam, which is great for velvet, I know, especially, and for fabrics like maybe sequined fabric that you don't want to touch the iron to. Just hold your iron like 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch above the fabric and going from the wrong side of the fabric. Hit it with a little bit of steam and, you know, flatten that out, and then do a little finger press afterward. I usually do when I'm using steam. And you can also try rolling it. I know rolling open your seams is something I've done with leather and faux leather fabrics that you don't want to press an iron to. So you can use, they make leather rollers like in the sewing world, specifically for sewing. I've heard people use like wallpaper rollers to roll out their seams, or just like a rolling pin from your kitchen, roll open those seams. So some different methods you can try so that you're not, you know, ironing out that texture of your fabric that you want to keep in.
Absolutely. So what if you accidentally iron out that texture? Can you put it back?
You could try for sure. If it's just like that wrinkled texture, you can, you know, fold it up a little bit again, and then hit it with the iron in just that little spot to press another little wrinkle in.
Perfect. All right, our next question here. Peggy wants to know, when sewing with knits, how can one prevent the fabric from getting caught in the feed dog?
It's a good question, Peggy. That is definitely a concern, especially when you're sewing with knits that are really like thin and fine and slinky. Something that you can do is to start your seams away from the raw edge, and that's good. That's a good tip for when you're sewing any sort of thin fabrics, even woven, to prevent them from, you know, getting pushed down into under the throat plate by the needle. start a couple of stitches back from the raw edge, and then back stitch 1 or 2 to get closer to the raw edge, and then continue your seam. You can also use a starter square. Start stitching on just like a scrap piece of fabric to get the seam started, and then butt your knit fabric seam line up to the edge of that and continue sewing onto that fabric. You can purchase a straight stitch throat plate, which just has, you know, a tiny little hole in the throat plate to allow the needle to go through. Now that you can't use a zigzag stitch with, you would break your needle because it only allows a single straight stitch throat plate, as the name suggests. So that will prevent your fabric from getting pushed down into the throat plate, because it's just, you know, a tiny little hole. The fabric's not going to get crammed down in there. But you can only use a straight stitch. And I know when you're sewing knits, a lot of times you need to use a zigzag stitch. Or you can use the good old tissue paper trick. Ashley's smiling because she knows that I'm going to bring this out.
I think we even went like a month though without you mentioning it. So I'm pretty excited though it's back.
It was time to bring in that tip. If you just throw a layer of tissue paper under your knit fabric as you're sewing the seam, it just provides just enough stabilization to keep the fabric from getting shoved down into the throat plate, and also from stretching out. It's a really good stabilizer to hold that fabric, keep it from stretching out. So, and then after you're done stitching, you can just tear that tissue paper away. So those are some things to try.
Perfect. All right, next question here. This is from Selena, and she says, I was wondering if you know a quick fix on a sewing machine where the bobbin winder is not moving. When I try to fill a bobbin with thread, it just beeps.
That's interesting. Well, you want to make sure that everything is threaded correctly. So maybe take another look at your machine manual if you haven't already, to make sure that everything is wound, everything is, you know, threaded correctly. And with my machine, you know, you've got to push the bobbin little thingy over to get it to click. So make sure it clicks to wind. Yeah, I'm not sure what other fixes I could throw out. You can Google it, you know, type that into your search bar, bobbin winder not working or bobbin winder beeping, and, you know, throw in your machine make and model in the search term to see for your specific machine. So yeah, sorry I can't be more specific on that. Good luck.
It's just tricky when you don't know the exact machine too, but definitely I think it's the not going over all the way. My machine is a brother. It's getting a little bit older, and I find that sometimes when I push it over, it does click, but it didn't quite click all the way over, and you have to kind of come back and then try it again. So if your machine is up there in age, that might be something too.
Yeah, click it back and then click it back again, or like give it a little wiggle or something.
Yeah. Learning the ins and outs of the older machines, you gotta make them work.
Yeah.
All right, next question here. They're looking for tips on how to sew bias tape onto a circle of vinyl fabric. They want to know if you can get a circle that's too small to where you won't have a nice smooth edge on your bias tape.
Yeah, I imagine when your curves get really, really, like the grade of the curve is so sharp, it might get tricky for your bias tape to smoothly go around. But I don't have like a specific diameter that would be too small. I haven't done that enough to have experimented with that. But if you get down there, you know, a tiny little circle that you're trying to bind, doing a knit fabric on the bias could also help instead of a woven fabric, because that will have a lot of stretch and a lot of give. So something to try.
Absolutely. All right, our next question here. When would you use horsehair in a hem?
Horsehair is fantastic. I just used that in a circle skirt to give the hem some more body. And that was the first time that I had used horsehair braid. So a lot of times they're used in bridal wear to give the hem of a bridal gown volume without adding the weight of like tulle and petticoats and whatever else you use to give a skirt volume. It's a really cool like vintage detail. I know it was used a lot like in historical sewing in the 1800s all the way through to like the 1940s and 50s to give those beautiful voluminous 50s skirts that great great drape. So you use it in a skirt to give the hem body and volume, and it comes in a lot of different widths. So it can come kind of narrow to just give a little bit of volume and stability, or if you get the wider strips, you know, the wider the strip, the more volume and body you're going to get in your hem.
Well, so just real quick, you have to explain what it is, because if someone's never used it, it's not like horse's hair, right?
It's not actual horsehair. Maybe it was like when it was invented and that's the name stuck, but now it is made with like a plastic webbing that is braided. So, you know, if you stretch it, it kind of narrows out. So it's that braided kind of plastic webbing in a strip. And on one end of the strip, if you get to like a wider variety, one long edge of the strip will have like a thread woven through. So you sew the one end without the thread. You sew that end to the raw edge of your garment, and then you fold it under to the wrong side, and then you pull up on that thread to, you know, gather in that horsehair, because you are, you know, folding it up into, if you're doing like an A-line skirt or a circle skirt, you're folding it up into a circumference that is smaller than the other edge. So you're pulling up on those threads to gather it in. And then you can machine stitch the upper edge. You can blind hem stitch by hand, just to secure that upper edge of the braid to your skirt or your dress or whatever you're doing. So it is, I think when I was doing my horsehair braid hem, I looked on Gertie's blog for Better Sewing. She has a good tutorial on there on how to use horsehair braid. And it's a really cool detail. And I made a circle skirt with it. So I made a full circle skirt. So it's got this huge hem, and I did like a huge 2 or 2.5 inch horsehair braid hem. So it's like this huge voluminous skirt. It's going to be in Sew News magazine sometime. I think maybe next year. I'm not sure when my projects go in. But
is it meant for like you, or meant for like a little girl? Like
for an adult.
Okay.
So yeah, you can look for that in Sew News. I give instructions on how to make your own circle skirt pattern and how to do horsehair braid hem. So it's fun.
Perfect. All right, we have time for one more question, and this is going to be kind of tricky, but it's something that if you do sewing for yourself and others, you may have thought about. But how do you know what to charge for custom sewing, or how do you decide how much to charge someone to make them something?
That is a really good question. It's so subjective to the type of thing you're doing, how much skill and time it takes, and also where you live too. Like if there's a lot of competition, you know, you want your prices maybe to be competitive or lower, or, you know, you can charge a premium if you're the only seamstress in town, and your services are in demand. But it all depends on how much you think your time is worth. You know, if you sat and spent 20 hours on this thing, you should be charging, you know, a bucket load, because that is a lot of your time. And for something that is like a wedding gown or something that's like requires a lot of skill, that's like a specialty item. You can charge buckets for that, I think. But But that's something that you can look around for, like in your area, or I suppose even now when, you know, with Etsy, you can sew things and sell them to anyone anywhere. So the regional thing might not be as important as just looking at other people who are selling like similar things and kind of gauging how your product sits amongst the competition. And if it's something that is more labor intensive and time consuming, you can absolutely charge more for it.
Absolutely. And just the one thing I would say is don't forget to add in material costs, because you may think, okay, I 20 bucks an hour is what I'm going to charge, but then don't forget that you spend $50 on materials, you know, and you don't want to be doing it for negative money.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So absolutely. Perfect. Well, thank you again so much for being here to answer all of our questions, and we will hopefully see you back again next month with more questions and more answers.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone have a good night.